The Spurs have traded Dejounte Murray to the Hawks for Danilo Gallinari and the rights to 4 first-round picks. Trae Young gets his wish. He's been dying to play with another dynamic young guard. Dejounte is an all-defense player who just made the All-Star team. Why would the Spurs give up on that? This guy on Twitter has a really good point. Oh, take more swings in the draft and hope they turn into Dejounte Murray? Great point. You already had Dejounte Murray. What is going on? Well, what have I told you? The Spurs actually won this trade. San Antonio got Dejounte with the 29th pick back in 2016. The second to last pick. Getting an all-star down there shows how amazing the Spurs are at the draft. He dropped so low because he was a bad shooter in college and he had kind of a sketchy past. The first time Dejounte was arrested was at 11 years old. He comes from a family of gang members in Seattle. Dude was hanging out on the streets from an early age until Jamal Crawford took him under his wing. Jamal helped Dejounte develop as a person and a player, and he got to play at home for Washington. The Spurs went downhill after they drafted Dejounte, but he took over for Tony Parker at point guard. Turns out, dude was a beast on the court and he was a good guy. He became the youngest player ever to make All-NBA defense in 2018, but he tore his ACL that next preseason. Awful timing because a lot of players really break out in year 3, but the Spurs still gave him a 4-year, $64 million extension. That's a big number, but it's also a team-friendly deal because Dejounte turned into one of the best young guards in the league. He was making less than Duncan Robinson, Lauri Markkanen, and Eric Bledsoe. So Dejounte Murray has an awesome story and the Spurs love him, so why would they trade him? The official deal looks like this. Spurs get Danilo Gallinari, 2023 first from the Hornets, a 2025 and 27 first from the Hawks, plus a 2026 pick swap. The Hornets pick is lightly protected, but the others are unprotected picks, which is huge. The only players who command unprotected picks are all NBA guys, like Paul George or James Harden, and unprotected going out to 2027? The Hawks were in a bidding war against the Knicks and the T-Wolves, and they paid a price. Now they'll have to pay Dejounte after next season, which is why the Spurs dealt him in the first place. They did not think he is worth a supermax. Dejounte Murray's agent is Rich Paul, who's notorious for getting top dollar for his guys. If Dejounte made All-NBA first, second, or third team next year, he could get the supermax. And for San Antonio, it would look like this. 5 years, over $212 million, about $42 million a year, more than LeBron James. That would make Dejounte the 5th highest paid player alive. Any other team could offer 4 years, $157 million. That's about the same as Giannis. He isn't worth that, but Rich Paul would have forced the Spurs to pay the supermax because he would threaten to leave if they don't. The Spurs have to overpay to keep star free agents. They're a small market team. They don't even have title contention to fall back on anymore. If the Spurs didn't pay up, he would just bounce for a team like the Lakers or the Heat. Here's a list of every Supermax player since it was introduced in 2016. Unless you're a contender for, best guy in the world, they're the worst contracts in the league. I'd even argue Damian Lillard's deal has hurt the Blazers. Dejounte Murray is not in the same category as Steph, Giannis, Luka, or Embiid, but the Spurs would have to pay him like that. Here's how his game is developed. He came into the league learning behind Tony Parker, increased his points and assists every year with great defense, but he never developed as a shooter. One thing Spurs fans always hope is whoever they draft that lacks shooting can learn it from a guy named Chip England. He is the coach that taught Kawhi Leonard how to shoot once he became a Spur. That turned Kawhi into an MVP type player. It's almost a meme now whenever they draft anyone. They're like, don't worry about it, we have Chip England. Well, Dejounte obviously did not turn into the next Kawhi, but Greg Popovich loved him. But the salary cap forced them to trade Dejounte. But the trade makes even more sense when you look at the timing. Dejounte's trade value will never be higher. 25 years old, just became an all-star, and he's under contract 2 more seasons. Once a guy becomes an expiring, he's worth a lot less approaching free agency. Dejounte's under Hawks control for 2 years, so they gave up a lot more. It hurts to lose Dejounte, but the Spurs have their eye on something a lot bigger. Victor Wembanyama is one of the best NBA prospects ever. He'll be the #1 pick in next year's draft. Wembanyama is a true unicorn at 7'2" with skills like a guard. He used to play for Tony Parker's team in France, but they don't need a former Spur to know he's a freak. Plus, he's not American. The Spurs are in love. Back in 1997, the Spurs drafted Tim Duncan and started a dynasty, and with a little luck, they're hoping to do the exact same in 2023. So back to that tweet that said, oh, the Spurs are just hoping one of these picks becomes the next Dejounte Murray. That's true, but they needed to reset the clock. I mean, Dejounte will be 26 years old next season. Half of his career is already over, and the Spurs just became one of the youngest teams in the league. They drafted 3 19-year-olds. And their new starting guard, Josh Primo, is 19. But what I don't hear a lot of people talking about is what if they go after DeAndre Ayton? Outside of the Suns, the Spurs are the only team now that could offer him a max contract. We'll know soon with free agency starting, but I think the much more likely scenario is the Spurs are going to use this cap space they now have to get even more picks to tank next season to try to get the #1 pick. But the problem is how hard it is to get a top pick. Back in 1997, the worst team had a much better chance to pick #1. Now, the bottom 3 teams each have an equal 14% chance, and that's not very good. Teams get unlucky every year. Like the Pistons last year had one of the worst records. They got the 5th pick. There's a really good chance the Spurs suck next season with no guarantees, but I also think the Hawks will be great. Dejounte brings defense in the backcourt, which they need, and it relieves Trae Young of some playmaking. I now expect Atlanta to be out of the Rudy Gobert sweepstakes. And by the way, that means if the Mavericks and the Raptors don't get Gobert, it's gonna be pretty awkward in Utah next year. But I want to know what the Hawks are going to do 2 off seasons from now. Because Dejounte was traded, Atlanta can give him the Supermax if he makes All-NBA. They also will have Trae Young on the Supermax, so they better hope this combination works. They could be locked into this roster for years. To be honest, I would have rather seen Dejounte go to the Timberwolves. I would love replacing D'Angelo Russell with Dejounte Murray, a much better defender who I trust a lot more in the playoffs. Dejounte next to Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns would have been a lot of fun. The other option was the Knicks, who are a disaster, like moving their entire team for Jalen Brunson. A long time ago, I made a Dejounte Murray feature more about his backstory. I mentioned it. He grew up, his family were all gang members. His great aunt was the founder of a gang, and also he had to move in with his grandmother who was 107 years old. It's the wildest story ever. Pretty cool to see how much Dejounte has overcome. You got that video right here. You should really check that out. And also, I think the West is going to be super deep next year, and the Clippers are really going to challenge the Warriors. But how concerned should the Warriors be? Check that one out.